The mist crept through the trees like cold fingers touching the ground, while the Roman torches fluttered silently. The wind cut through the forest with a strange, almost human whistle, and the smell of wet wood mingled with the sweat of the legionnaires who marched without understanding why the path never seemed to end. The commander raised his hand to stop the column, but the sound of branches breaking in the distance made everyone turn around at the same time, as if a single instinct screamed, "Danger!" The tensions squeezed the air. Nothing moved but the shadows. The silence was so heavy that the slamming of the shields seemed like a mistake. No one knew that this route, chosen for a rapid advance, was the biggest strategic mistake of the night, a mistake that Rome would never officially admit. Among the trees, strange marks appeared on the trunk, Germanic symbols of war, which no legionnaire should have seen there. The older centurion whispered that this was a warning, but no one had the courage to repeat it. The darkness closed as if it were alive, and the first doubt arose. Why had the local guide disappeared minutes before? But what happened next was even worse. The ranks were trying to reorganize when a scream tore through the forest, coming from some point impossible to locate. It was not human. It was not an animal. It was something between the two, as if the forest itself had a voice. The torches fluttered in their trembling fists, revealing huge trunks covered in moss and shadows that seemed to move on their own. The commander ordered defensive formation, but the soldiers realized that they were surrounded by a silence that watched, judged, and waited. The floor was too wet. Footprints disappeared in seconds, as if the earth swallowed them. A fatal mistake made hours earlier, advancing with heavy armor on terrain no one knew, was beginning to prove irreversible. A young legionnaire looked up and saw figures passing through the branches, too fast to be human. Nobody believed him. Roman arrogance would prevent any confession of fear. Among the mists, a banner fell without anyone touching. It just fell, as if pulled by the darkness. The veterans understood that this was no coincidence. It was a death warning. But what crossed the forest in the next instant changed everything. Branches snapped above their heads, and everyone raised their shields at the same time, as if instinct struggled to protect what reason no longer understood. The moon barely crossed the canopy, creating slits of light where shadows glided too fast to be mistaken for men. The smell of upturned earth rose strongly, as if someone had dug the ground recently. The tension was so dense that even the sound of breathing seemed dangerous. One of the scouts advanced a few steps, and when he raised the torch, he saw imprinted in the mud marks of bare feet, mixed with footprints that no one recognized. They looked human, but too long, too deep, as if something very heavy moved. Silently through the woods, the Roman fault lay before them, relying on maps delivered by peoples who never bowed to the empire. The commander tried to order partial retreat, but the forest responded before him. An icy blast extinguished half of the torches, plunging the legion into living darkness. And what would emerge soon after would make many wish they had never entered there. The third cry did not come from the forest. It came from within the formation itself, when a legionary fell with his throat open without anyone having seen a single spear arrive. The panic ran faster than any order. Short arrows began to appear out of nowhere, coming from impossible angles, ricocheting off shields, finding gaps between helmets and breastplates. There was no enemy line, only flashes of metal between the trees and shadows running in circles. The Romans were trained to face armies, not ghosts. Human error appeared. Centurions shouted different orders at the same time, breaking the iron. Discipline that sustained the empire. In a few minutes, the legion ceased to be a wall and became a confused mass. The forest, once just a scenario, was now a weapon. And each tree seemed to hide a killer who knew exactly where to strike. The worst thing is that for many, the enemy remained invisible. It was only when a torch fell next to a log that some soldiers finally saw what Rome would never admit in official reports. Among the branches, painted with mud and blood, barbarians watched, smiling, wearing pieces of Roman equipment mixed with their own skins. One of them wore around his neck the brooch of the allied guide who had disappeared. The betrayal was not a rumor, it was a fact, hung as a trophy. Reliance on local knowledge had become a perfect trap. The route they promised to be shortest was actually a death row prepared in advance. Cut logs blocked any retreat, hidden ditches swallowed men and horses. With each step back, one more fell. The commander realized too late that he no longer controlled anything, neither the terrain nor the maps, nor the men themselves. And when he tried to regroup, he found that part of the wings simply did not respond anymore. Instead of a great fight, what followed was something much worse. The Legion began to be cut into small, isolated groups, like precisely sliced meat. Squads that had marched together for years could no longer see each other through the thick fog. The rain thickened, turning the ground into mud that grabbed the sandals and sucked the bodies that fell. There were metal shocks, strangled screams, and soon after, nothing. A quick, cruel silence, which meant that another group had been erased. Some desperate people threw away shields to run faster. Another deadly mistake in territory prepared for hunters, not warriors of formation. The arrogance of Rome, which believed it was invincible in any scenario, melted into sweat, blood, and fear. And every minute, more men disappeared into the darkness as if they were erased from history itself. Hours later, the battlefield no longer looked like a battle. There was no front line, there was no organized retreat, there was no flag to follow. Only small pockets of resistance remained, crushed one by one, until the noise became rare, distant, almost an echo. When the last group tried to break through the forest towards what they thought was open terrain, they found only swamp in disguise. Men sank in full armor, pulled through the dense mud. They left. No body, no trace, only air bubbles and the brief sound of despair. There, the term disappear ceased to be an expression and became a concrete reality. There was no way to bury, collect, record. The forest swallowed men, metal, screams, and returned only silence. That night, 30,000 legionnaires were erased in a calculated ritual of death, and Rome was slow to admit that she didn't even know where they had fallen. Much later, another Roman army was sent to restore honor and show that the empire did not forget affronts. But what they found in the heart of that forest was not a battle, it was an exposed cemetery. Skulls nailed to trunks, bones lined up in circles, shields turned upside down as a sign of eternal defeat. The forest had changed, but it still carried the same heavy smell of moisture and rusty iron. Among the remains, they noticed something disturbing. There were hardly any complete armor. Many had been taken. Others were buried so deep that they seemed to have been hidden on purpose. Reports told of altars made from the remains of Roman standards, evidence of a massacre that was not only military, but symbolic. It was humiliation turned into a message, and this message was not for the dead. It was for the empire itself. The official version, recorded in tables and reports, spoke of defeat in hostile terrain, of storm, of strategic misfortune. But the accounts of the soldiers who were there said something else, much darker. They spoke of an army that was not only defeated, but erased in the most calculated way possible, as if the enemy wanted to tear 30,000 men from the memory of the world. It was not just war, it was punishment against pride. Some generals insisted that the horror found be accurately recorded, but many details were softened or omitted. After all, to admit that Rome was deceived, betrayed, and devoured by a forest guided by barbarians was to tarnish the myth of invincibility. Thus was born the idea that those legionnaires simply disappeared. And in a way, it was true. They disappeared from the maps, the honors, the celebrations. In the end, the night when 30,000 legionnaires disappeared without a trace was not just a military disaster. It was a cruel mirror placed before the face of Rome. The arrogance of relying too much on one's own strength, the contempt for the terrain, the blindness in the face of betrayal, all took a heavy toll. The forest only ended what human decisions began. Every step taken without question, every order carried out without thinking, every ignored alert pushed that army to the erasure. The historical lesson is harsh. No empire is so large that it cannot be swallowed up by its own pride. And often, what history records as mystery is just shame turned into silence. If this story has marked you, like, comment, and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue bringing hidden truths from Rome.